President Cyril Ramaphosa revealed in his State of the Nation address this week that the first two phases of the presidential employment stimulus programs supported over 850,000 work opportunities. He said more than 80% of participants were young people, with over 60% of them women. The programs, he said, would soon reach over 1 million South African direct beneficiaries. Our Socio-Economic Research Institute Director of Research, Angelo Fick, joins us to weigh in on the benefits of social employment funds. Angelo, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon.
Now, on Thursday evening, the President, of course, announced that the first two phases of this presidential stimulus program had, of course, managed to create work opportunities. I mean, just over 850,000 work opportunities. However, you know, when we look at statistics, when we look at the data, we know that in the third quarter of last year, unemployment reached close to 34.9%. So clearly there's some sort of misalignment with regards to what government is doing and what we're actually seeing on the ground. Help us make sense of this disjuncture that we're faced with.
So I think we need to firstly accept that these are not jobs, these are work opportunities. And so they have a very temporary function and a very temporary existence. And as the President pointed out, in his vision and the vision of his administration, government does not create jobs. Government enables an environment in which other people create jobs. And if you have economic shrinkage, partly because of poor economic performance, you also have the problem of the pandemic, which shrunk the economy further. It's very difficult to imagine growing the number of actual jobs in the private sector. Beyond that, you also have to remember that there's a global environment in which increasingly investors want immediate and massive return on investment. And so there is a sort of foregrounding of profit and not necessarily a longer term investment in economic growth opportunities that see 30 to 50-year returns on investment. And so what you're looking at is a very complex environment in which young people have to not just engage with the actual market factors, but also with the specific demands of the people who, have other economic incentives rather than economic growth and job opportunities in their heads. They're mostly interested in profit. And so admirable as the President's initiatives are, we do need to take into account the environment that is being created may in fact be contrary to the idea of job creation.
Now, I believe that the President attempted to address this particular issue that you raised by sort of shifting his focus away from public investments being the means by which jobs are actually created, and certainly putting it, or at least putting the onus on the private sector and businesses to create these jobs. The only, I would say, sort of promise that he made was that government would actually create an enabling environment for business to be able to create the jobs that are needed. Is that statement alone enough in this instance?
I think it depends entirely on your ideological perspective and your political position. So, when government says and when the President says they will create an enabling environment, the question is, what is the detail of that enabling environment? In other words, are people's labor rights continuously being protected? Or do we see the kind of casualization of labor which allows people to invest and for business people to make profit, but the conditions under which people are employed, very, very difficult. The President also suggested that, the kinds of changes that he'd like to see is a lowering of the demand of experience from people who are going to enter the job market. But the problem there is that we have a training sector in the higher education sector that is supposed to kind of counterbalance that by providing people not just with training, but also with a certain kind of practical experience in the TVET system. So the corruptions and problems inside our education system are partly responsible for the ways in which the labor market responds to those who enter it. Secondly, we talk about education results year on year, as universities trump about the number of graduates that they, put into the system, as the Minister of Basic Education crows about the numbers of people who finish matric with distinctions. But the question is, do the skills that people come out with match the skills that are required in order to be employed? And the President sort of touched on this when he spoke about how people come out of the system with degrees and can't be employed in the sectors that they've qualified in. The question then should be, are those degrees, I'm not going to mention the disciplines, but many people know what they are, these degrees that really produce thousands of graduates who have to be absorbed into the system. A third problem, of course, is the very system the president defended at the Zondo Commission of Inquiry, which is the cadre deployment system. So, even inside municipalities, people who come with engineering and commerce qualifications often don't get the positions that are being advertised because they're inside the cadre network, which tells young people that the education that their families sacrifice so much for them to get really isn't the only means or even the primary means to enter the job market in their local space in small towns and rural municipalities.
Angelo, I just want to kind of stay on this issue of, job creation by means of public investment versus the private sector, and wonder if there isn't a case for the president in this instance. I mean, we often bemoan how large and inflated the public sector wage bill is, that it in fact needs to be reduced, and yet when the president appears to be trying to do just that, not only try to shift the responsibility, but to assist the private sector by, as you mentioned, enabling, the environment, there is so much backlash. So what is it exactly that we need to hear from the president when it comes to the issue of job creation?
Well, we need the detail, which we'll presumably hear from the Minister of Finance in the budget speech, but also from the various other ministries that will have to give their reports on what it is that they wish to have as the vision of the administration. It isn't just a matter of enabling businesses to create jobs in this environment. It's also a matter of balancing out the political needs of the country with what those businesses may want. So we hear from the President that there's stuff in green energy, and that's its own certain kind of, how shall one put this, oxymoron. There are, all sorts of options being, auctioned off on the freight system from Durban to City Deep. What are the additional job creation mechanisms that those who wish to participate in those projects are being required to do in order to make sure that they get the bid? So it's not just the lowest bid, it's the bid that also comes in with the maximum number of job creation, attached to it. And then, people bemoan the public sector wage bill, but that's, I think, too blanket a statement. There are ways of curtailing the wage bill without curtailing the public sector itself. It's, in some respects, there are often people at the very top end of the public sector who earn obscene amounts of money and have no kind of consequence management of their mismanagement. People who work in municipalities or live in municipalities where, people haven't worked but continue to draw their salaries. People who are implicated in corruption, who continue to draw their salaries even when they have been found guilty or are moved from one municipality to the other. That legislation which prevented that only really kicked in very recently. So we have to be aware that the president, is doing a very, well-intentioned project by suggesting that there should be cooperation between the private sector and the public sector. But it's not an either-or, that we should somehow simply reduce the number of people who work in the public sector. If you tell nurses that their jobs are going to be cut, there are consequences for that very social compact that the president wants to engender, because there are consequences, as we saw in the pandemic, for the kind of health care that we can then expect in our public sector. However, we still have a bloated cabinet. We have a very bloated director general system at the top end of the public sector, public service, and we have all sorts of replications of functions that have to do with that cadre deployment system that the president defended, and that I think many of us have been very tired of for well over 2 decades. That it is not necessarily the best get hired into these positions, and despite the president's promises that there will be a professionalization of the public service, we haven't yet seen the mechanisms by which this will happen, precisely because it's an ANC election here. He cannot implement that this year without consequences inside the African National Congress and the patronage network that has pockmarked our policy implementation and our political system.
All right, Angelo, thank you so much. We are going to have to leave it there. That's Director of ASRI, Angelo Fick, helping us there to unpack the presidential stimulus program.